Well, this morning we're going to be in the book of Exodus. So if you would go ahead and turn your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3. And last week we left off talking about Jacob. Now last year we did a series called Putting God First. And in that series we spent a lot of time dealing with Joseph. So we're not going to spend much time on Joseph. I will mention or refer to him this morning. But what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at God's provision in the book of Exodus and God's provision in the lives of his people. So last week we talked about Jacob and told the story of Jacob and how Jacob, because of deceiving his parents, deceiving his older brother, he basically had to flee home and go to live with his uncle Laban, who was his mother's brother, And so he went to live there, he worked there. Laban was a deceiver. Jacob reaped some of the wrong seed that he sowed, and so he went through some hard knocks in life, but yet because he walked with God, God blessed him, God favored him. And living with Laban, his uncle, he married 2 women, and this happened because his uncle took advantage of him. He wanted to marry the younger sister, Rachel, but Laban took advantage of him. He got married off first to Leah. And so then he was like, well, I really want Rachel. And so he worked another 7 years, 14 years total, so he could have Rachel. And I told the story of how that Rachel, the younger sister, was the wife that he favored. He loved her. He favored her. He bought her all the extra gifts and those things. And we mentioned that this is a very dangerous thing in a family, and that is showing favoritism. Isaac and Rebekah, they showed favoritism. Isaac favored Esau, the older son. Rebekah favored Jacob, the younger son. And then Jacob, he did the same thing in his family. And I mentioned last week, we come to places like this in the Bible and we think, what are they doing? Why does Jacob have 2 wives? Nowhere did God say, do this. Nowhere did God say this was a good idea. And it caused grief and turmoil in their family. Yet, despite the mistakes Jacob made, God still used him, and God still used his family. Mentioned that it was Leah through whom she gave birth to Levi. You have then Moses and Aaron. They came through Leah. And it was Rachel that she gave birth to Joseph. And of course, you know the story of Joseph. He was favored by Jacob. Why? He was Rachel's boy. And so Jacob favored Joseph, and so the older brothers decided that they would sell him into slavery. They did, and he ended up in Egypt. Yet every step of the way in Egypt, God took care of him, God provided him, and by the end of that story, Joseph was the second most powerful man in Egypt. The only person more powerful was Pharaoh himself. And we see things like this, we read stories like this, and it's easy to think or wonder, question, God, what is going on? Yet this is why it's important that you not just read a chapter here or there in the Bible, but you read entire books of the Bible, because God sees things with a much bigger perspective than we see things. In the society we live in, we expect everything to happen in the next 5 minutes. Maybe you have a friend like this that, they send you a text message and you don't respond within 30 seconds. And then you get another text message, why didn't you read my text? And then 30 seconds later, are you angry at me? Why haven't you responded? We all know people like this. We live in this society. We expect everything to happen just like this. But God sees things in a much bigger perspective, long term. In Genesis 15, when God cut his covenant with his man Abraham, in Genesis 15, God told Abraham that his children, his descendants, would spend 400 years journeying in the area of Egypt. And he told him it was for a reason and a purpose. God said in Genesis 15, the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. What was going on? Big picture, in the area of Canaan, there were some wicked people. Not only did they worship false gods, they were incredibly immoral. They were incredibly brutal. They sacrificed their children to the gods they worshiped, and not just babies. They would sacrifice 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12-year-old children. They would throw their children into the fires of pagan gods. Wicked, evil. One of the people groups that God wanted them to destroy was the Amalekites. The Amalekites were some of the most brutal, evil people to ever walk the face of the earth. When they would go into a city, they were so evil before they would kill women that were pregnant, they would cut their bellies open, pull out the babies, kill the babies in front of them, and then kill the mothers. That is how evil they were. And so, big picture, God's plan was not just to bring His people into the promised land. God's plan, big picture, was to use His people, His children, the descendants of Abraham, to enact judgment on some of those wicked, evil people living in the promised land. And so we have to keep big picture things in mind. It's easy in the midst of things to say, what is going on? What is God doing? Joseph in his life could have said, God, why did you allow my brothers to sell me, to send me into slavery? God had a reason and a purpose. God was going to use him. God was going to raise him up so that during one of the worst famines the world had ever seen, Jacob and his wives and all of their children would have food to eat. We've got to think big picture. And so they ended up in Egypt. The descendants of Abraham ended up in Egypt. And the Bible tells us that after Joseph died, a Pharaoh came to power that did not know Joseph and did not know what had gone on with Joseph. And they took the children of Abraham and they put them into slavery. And so when Exodus begins in Exodus 1 and 2, the children of Abraham are in slavery. They are in bondage. And awful things were going on and happening. This Pharaoh had ordered, much like King Herod in the New Testament, that all of their baby boys should be put to death. They told the midwives, when you deliver children, if the child is a male, to kill it on the spot. And the midwives, they didn't want to do it. So then Pharaoh issued an order and he said, any male children born to these people, throw them into the Nile. Well, what do you have in the Nile? You have crocodiles. They were so awful, so evil, they were taking their children and throwing them to their death in the Nile. Yet God is a provider. Even in a culture of death, even in a place where they were slaves, God was their provider. You know, sometimes we have the perspective that if negative things are going on, or if we're in a negative situation, or if negative things are happening around us, or if, you know, there are layoffs at work, or if the unemployment's increasing, that God cannot provide. Circumstances do not limit God's ability to provide. God can provide even in the worst of circumstances. And even in the worst of circumstances, even in slavery, God's people are to be people of faith. Think about Christian people today. Think about Christians living in China. In China, you're only allowed to have one child. And because of that, most families, if they have a baby girl first, they kill that child because they want a boy. They're going to have a child, they want a boy. Since just 1971, 336 million children have been put to death, have been aborted in China. 336 million. If you're a Christian family living there, what do? You have to look to God to provide. And so there was a woman in Egypt, and they had a baby boy, and they looked to God to provide. They made a basket, they put him in the Nile, and that boy's name was Moses. He was the deliverer of Israel. And Pharaoh's daughter, she came across the basket. She took him. She raised him as her own. The book of Hebrews tells us that Moses was raised in the household of Pharaoh. He had access to all the wisdom, the knowledge, the education, the riches of Egypt. Yet there came a point in his life when he chose God over Egypt. He was the deliverer. God can provide even in a culture of death. So God sent Moses. Let's look at Exodus chapter 3, beginning in verse 7. This is God speaking to Moses. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. It's interesting here that God uses some of the same language we talked about last week, that when we go through things in life, God knows what we're going through. As we saw when we talked about Leah, God sees and God hears. And when God hears, He answers. And what's so amazing here is that God tells Moses, I myself have come down. Something is going to happen. Now, when we think about the time that they were in Egypt, we can freak out over the numbers. But once again, God has a big Picture perspective. From the time when Isaac was 5 years old to the time Jacob arrived in Egypt during the time of famine, you had 215 years. During Joseph's life, the Israelites enjoyed 71 years of peace and prosperity under Joseph. After his death, you then had 144 years of slavery. But as I was studying this week, this was what was so interesting to me. Moses was born 64 years after Joseph's death. It's easy to read this story and get overwhelmed by the numbers and hundreds of years, but within 64 years after Joseph died, the deliverer of Israel was born, within a single generation. So it's easy to think, well, what is God doing? What is going on? Moses was born within 64 years of Joseph's death. The Israelites were then delivered when Moses was 80. So God tells Moses, I have come down. Verse 9 here in chapter 3. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And we all know the story. Moses goes. Pharaoh is not receptive to Moses saying, let my people go. God then sends 10 horrible, awful plagues on Egypt. But you know, as I read this week, what stood out to me is that with each plague, the plagues only affected the Egyptians, not the Israelites. The 10 plagues. The first was water to blood. The Nile turned to blood. Even the water they had set aside in jars and containers turned to blood. That's a miracle. Cannot be explained. Next, God sent frogs. Then he sent gnats or lice. If you've ever known someone that's had lice, not a pleasant experience. But imagine there being so many lice and gnats that it's all you could see. You getting itchy where you're sitting? Their livestock became diseased. All of their animals started dying. God struck them with boils, open wounds that scratching did not relieve. Then God sent hail mixed with fire. After that, God sent locusts. And the book of Exodus describes it as all you could see were locusts. The 9th plague, he sent darkness upon the land. Yet none of these things affected the Israelites. And when it comes to darkness, it even says in Exodus that it was dark in the areas where the Egyptians were, but it was daylight in Goshen where the Israelites were. So friends, you know, it's easy to look at the news and to see negative things happening in the world and think, what are we going to do? No matter where you are, in the good place or in the desert, God provides for his people. When you are a person of faith and walk with God, God provides for you. And even when God sends judgment, God's judgment affects the wicked, but he takes care of the righteous. I mean, this is crazy. It was dark where the Egyptians were and daylight where the Israelites were. And then, of course, we know the last, God sent the angel of death. And of course, what was this? Well, the Egyptians were putting to death for many years the firstborn males of the Israelites. So God sent the angel of death to kill the firstborn of every male Egyptian. We then see the next example of increase that helped. All of these things happened. And finally, Pharaoh said, you can go. Proverbs 13:22 says that a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. When God spoke to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, he also told him this in Exodus 3:21 through 22. I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor, and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Literally, they would leave with all of the wealth of Egypt. That's what God said would happen. Exodus chapter 12. That is precisely what did happen. With each plague, Pharaoh would say, okay, you can go. No, you can't. His heart was hard. And finally, they said, leave, leave, leave. Exodus 12, verse 33, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave. For otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added. And they had dough because God had said to prepare unleavened bread. and carried on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. Verse 35, the Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold for clothing. Verse 36, the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. Decades in slavery. The total years of slavery were 144. 400 from the time that they had spent with Isaac and Jacob, not in the place where God had sent Abraham. In one day, God gave them the wealth they were owed. One day, they plundered Egypt. God can increase you in ways that you cannot even imagine. God can do things that you cannot even imagine. And look at the language here. God made them favorably disposed, not to want to kill them, to want them to go, but here, take all our stuff with you. Who does this? It is God. It is the hand of God. And when God moves, no one can stop the hand of God. And there's even places here in these chapters where God says that I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart because I'm going to enact judgment. And then we're going to come to the next example of increase, to the Red Sea. You would think they would leave these people alone, yet God told Moses, I'm going to send him after you because I'm going to destroy him. I'm going to judge him for all that they have done. This will be a sign to all the nations of the earth. There are big picture things happening here. One day, God made up to them all the years of slavery. They plundered the Egyptians and took all their wealth with them. God made them favorably disposed. You might say, Austin, I have the worst boss ever. You cannot even imagine how awful my boss is. God can make anyone favorably disposed toward you. God directs, as the book of Proverbs says, the heart of the king in whatever direction he chooses. God can do anything. All things are possible with God. We then read that God provided them with directions. These people, they didn't know anything about living God or serving God. You know, Moses is the exception. And so to make it easy, God gave them a cloud by day and a fire by night. As we saw in Exodus 3, as God told Moses, he came down himself to deliver them, to lead them out of slavery and bondage. We then come to Exodus 14, to the Red Sea. We all know this story. We learned it in Sunday school or children's church. They come to the Red Sea. They're trapped. What will they do? And I'm going to have them put up some images. Let's put up the first one, the image of the map. Now, you know, if you go to a place like TCU or SMU or UT or any of these places, they mess all this up. The Red Sea is this huge body of water. You can see it, the southern portion of the map. And then there are two Gulf areas. Now, Egypt in Moses' day was much bigger than it is today. You know, it's really ignorant when somebody says, well, where's Egypt on the map today? And they assume that's how big Egypt was thousands of years ago. Egypt extended all the way into this peninsula you see there. And it was actually called the wilderness of Egypt. Now, today, this peninsula is called the Sinai Peninsula. And you might say, well, why is it called that? Is that what the Egyptians called it? Nope. Is that what Moses called it? Nope. The ancient Israelites. How did that peninsula get its name? Well, Constantine, of course, you know the story. He converted to Christianity for political expediency. It's like today when somebody runs for political office and they say, I'm a Christian, just so Christians will vote for them. Constantine did the same thing. And one of the things that they did is they went into the ancient world and they set up religious sites. And so Constantine's mother had the idea that Mount Sinai was here on this peninsula. She had no evidence for it, no proof for it, no archaeological evidence. The people that lived in that area didn't believe it was there. She actually had a dream in which she believed that this is the spot, this is the place, this is the peninsula, and so it's been called the Sinai Peninsula ever since because somebody had a dream. Friends, that is not good evidence for anything. And so we find out, headed into Exodus 14, that they journeyed out of Egypt. Well, you don't get out of Egypt on this map until you get to this right side where it says the Gulf of Aqaba. Egypt extended all the way over to the right-hand side of this. And so they came out of Egypt. They were journeying out. They came to this place where it's the tip of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, and that is where they crossed. And this is why you go to college, they twist, they distort, they deny because they do not want to believe in the miraculous power of God. They actually say such stupid stuff like they crossed in a little body of water over on the left-hand side that was like a marsh. Well, friends, if God drowned the entire Egyptian army in a marsh and 2 feet of water like on Duck Dynasty, that is even a bigger miracle than parting the Red Sea. So when you go to college, just don't believe everything that they tell you. The Bible actually refers to this Gulf of Aqaba as the Red Sea more than 5 times. And in Solomon's day, Solomon was so powerful and wealthy, they actually had their own navy that sailed this. And Solomon identified that spot on the map. You can see it where it says Gulf of Aqaba. He identified that place as the crossing and erected columns there. We all put the picture of the columns up. On either side, he put a column up marking the spot as the place where they crossed. Now put the next image up. The one that shows the mountains and the beach. Thank you. Now this is the place that they came to. And the scholars have done the research. On this entire peninsula, this is the only place that could have held that number of people. The Bible tells us that there were 600,000 men, just men, not counting women and children and wives. So that means there were at least over 2 million people. This is the only beach, the entire peninsula, that would fit that many people. And what's interesting about this, there in that spot is not as deep as the rest of the Gulf of Aqaba. There's a plateau there in the water, and when they crossed and God parted the water, it would have been like city skyscrapers on either side. And that plateau they crossed was a 1/4 mile to 1/2 mile wide, just wide enough for that number of people to cross. But on either side of it, the water is 3,000 to 5,000 feet deep, which means in places it's nearly a mile deep. And so, Solomon put markers there. It's pretty arrogant when people in our society today, because they have a PhD, think they know more about where stuff was than somebody who actually lived in the ancient world. It's pretty arrogant. I would say Solomon, he probably had a better idea than the college professor down the street. And guess what they found in the waters of these areas? Chariot wheels, bones, evidence of bodies. It's all there. People choose to deny evidence of God's miraculous hand in history. So they were gathered here on this beach. We go to the last image where it shows the water. Now we go there to Exodus 14. They're there, and it's very much, Moses, what are we going to do? Well, there were mountains on either side behind them. The Egyptian army was coming. So look, that is a scary thing. You're there at the water, body to body, a lot of BO. It smells. You got your cattle, your livestock. The Egyptians are coming. It says that Pharaoh sent 600 of his best chariots and then the rest of his army. Pharaoh and the army is coming, and then you look at that. We're toast, Moses. See, this is a miracle. And this takes the hand of God. You know what locals in this area call this place today? They call it Nuwaba al-Muzayina. You know what that means? Waters of Moses opening. It takes somebody with a PhD to mess this up. Exodus 14, beginning in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to camp by the sea directly opposite Baal-Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. As I said, this whole peninsula was known as the wilderness of Egypt. They were still in Egyptian territory, and God wanted him to think He wanted the Egyptians to think they were confused. Verse 4, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And he told Moses to raise his staff in his hand, and the water would part. As I said, even on this plateaued area of land where they walked across, the height of this water would have been like city skyscrapers. And off the plateau, it was deep, up to a mile in depth in some places. This is a bona fide miracle of God. What did Moses tell the people? Verse 13. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Put the picture of the beach up again. They're there. They're on the beach. This is an impossible situation. They're toast. But God moves. His hand moves. And he, through his man Moses, parts the water. And they journey across. And God not only delivers them, God drives the Egyptians down into the mud, into the depths. He doesn't let the Israelites get across and then bring the water back down to freak the Egyptians out. He lets the Egyptians get all the way in it, nearly to the other side, and then he tells Moses, "Lower your hands." When God moves, God moves. Only be still. There are times in life, friends, you have just to believe God. You have got to just have faith in God. And you might want to say something negative. You might want to say something critical. You might want to question God and say, "God, what are you doing? What is going on?" You need to be still. You need to zip the upper lip. You need to be quiet, and you need to just determine, I am going to believe God. I am going to have faith in God. I am going to do whatever God says do. I am going to trust the Lord. He's our source. He's our provider. And even when it looks totally, completely, and utterly impossible, God can move. And think about this. When all of those bad plagues had happened, it didn't affect the Israelites. These people should not have any faith problems. Yet they doubted, they questioned, they grumbled, they complained. Even here, God parts the waters. They journey across on dry land. God frees them. They have all the wealth of Egypt, and yet they still had trouble believing that God provides. As we go on into Exodus chapter 15, we see that after they were freed, they crossed the Red Sea. They then traveled 3 days. They were without water. They needed water. They came to a place where the water was bitter, and they started to grumble, and they complained, and they said things like, "Moses, we would have been better off in Egypt." What? We had it better as slaves. You're free. You're free. Yet every step of the way, the majority grumbled and they complained. So God spoke to Moses. God told him to throw a piece of wood into the water. He did, and they were able to drink the water. In Exodus 16, God then provides food for them. He provides them manna in the morning and quail in the evening. In Exodus 16, beginning in verse 4, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see if they will follow my instructions." And of course, some didn't. Verse 31, it describes what manna was like. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. You know, as a child, whenever I would read this or they talk about it in children's church or Sunday school, I always thought of honeycomb cereal because of the description that it tasted like wafers made with honey. And, you know, my mom, she would never buy us stuff like that. But thanks be to God, my father, he would buy us Cinnamon Toast Crunch and honeycomb cereal and Fruity Pebbles. God bless him forever. But we had a fun discussion on Facebook last night. One guy said that when he read this, he always imagined sopapillas. Amen. But God bless them. They came out and there was bread to eat in the morning, but was the bread good enough? No. God, I need a steak. I need a burger. I want a cheeseburger to fall out of the heavens. So God provided quail for them to eat. Quail came in the evening, and they didn't even have to shoot it, blow it out of the sky or anything, and they came down on the ground. But this is the problem with grumbling and complaining. This is the problem with saying, God, your provision is not good enough. God, the income you have blessed me with is not good enough. God, the husband or the wife you have blessed me with is not good enough. It can tick him off. In the book of Numbers, when they were complaining about not having any meat, God's response was, fine, I'll give you some meat. I'll give you so much meat, it'll be coming out of your ears and your nostrils. Now look, that is not something you ever want God saying. we ought to be thankful. We ought to be grateful. Whatever He has blessed us with, wherever He has brought us, we ought to be so grateful and thankful. Never grumble, never complain, never doubt, never question His provision. But they did that. And so then again, they came to a place in Exodus 17 where there was no water. They wanted water. And you would think God's already provided them with water. God's already provided them with manna on the ground and quail. You would think they would get that no matter how impossible it looks. God's going to provide. And yet they grumbled and they complained. Exodus 17, beginning in verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Once again, just ridiculous. Moses did not bring them out of Egypt to die, but they kept accusing him of it. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered him, "Walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go." So if you would put the image, that first image of the map back up for me. Now this is why going to the right college is important. So you have bonehead academics that say, well, it had to have been on a marsh over on the left-hand side. Well, then they say, well, golly gee whiz, in this peninsula, there's no evidence of the Israelites being there. No, duh, you're looking in the wrong place, guys. So if you go with what the Bible actually says and what the best evidence points to, you then start to find all the places the Bible talks about. Go ahead and put up the images of the rock at Horeb. So this will rock your world. So, this was not like a little pebble. Moses didn't crack a rock. God tells him to take his staff and to hit a rock. He says, verse 5, "Walk on ahead of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So it says Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. So you begin going to the part of the world that Solomon believed was the right part of the world, the right place, not where Constantine's mother thought it was. You then start finding the actual places where these things happen. And this whole valley where this rock is, the way that people have been there to describe it is like from that spot, a huge, mighty rushing river came out, eroding the ground away. So this is, again, the hand of God, the provision of God. So this isn't some little itsy-bitsy, Bible story we tell kids in children's church. This is the miraculous hand of God, God moving in a way that cannot be denied. So he tells Moses to take his staff and to strike this rock. If I had been there, that would have scared the you-know-what out of me. Here's the man, the leader, the pastor. You doubters, you grumblers, you complainers, see the hand of God. Boom, water from the rock. It is absolutely astounding. Who can bring water from a rock? Who in one day can make up to you decades of pay you have not received? Who in one moment, one day, 1 hour can bring deliverance when you need it most? No one but the Most High God. But you have got to trust Him. You have got to believe Him. You have got to put your faith in Him. You have got to make Him your source. You have got to decide that He is the source, He is the God, He is the provider, and that you are going to go with Him and follow Him no matter what. And pastors preached it many times of them going into the promised land and how they grumbled, they complained, and Moses sent the 12 spies, and 10 of them said, oh, they're giants. Do you know if you actually go and read there how many sons of Anak there were? It's 3 or 4. There were 3 or 4 of them, and they acted like there were millions and millions and millions and millions of giants. They were liars. They were doubters. As the book of Hebrews says, they did not believe God. You've got to decide. Do you believe? The doctor gives you a bad report. Do you believe? You get laid off from your job. Do you believe? Do you believe that God can provide no matter how bad it looks? He is the provider. He is the blesser. He is the one that brings increase, and He does it in such a crazy way. It cannot be explained. And this is why liberal college professors and scholars, they put so much work into muddying the water so that people do not see evidence on earth of the reality and the power and the might of God. And as I said, you go to college and they talk about how it was just a marsh the people crossed. If God drowned the entire Egyptian army in a marsh, that's an even bigger miracle. So look to Him as your source. Look to Him as your provider. Psalm 78 beginning in verse 40, David sums up these days. He says, how often they provoke Him, God, in the wilderness and grieve Him in the desert. Yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They remembered not His hand, nor the day when He delivered them from the enemy. They were not thankful. So I just want to encourage you. We're all believing God for things. We all got goals. We all got things we're praying for. Be thankful. Be grateful right where you're at. Trust God. Believe God. Your circumstances do not limit God's ability to provide. They don't. The economy doesn't. The job you work doesn't. Whoever's president doesn't. Wherever you live doesn't. Nothing limits God's ability to provide except unbelief. And that's where we're going to be headed next Sunday, to talk about the danger of unbelief, the danger of complaining, the danger of grumbling against God. Well, I hope the message this morning has been a blessing to you.